Hi guys. Few words before I start. So this slide deck, it's the same slide deck that I'm going to use in a conference, which is the DevOps Days in Copenhagen. So some of the slides, this is intended for external people. So keep in mind that when seeing the slides, because there's some reference like with Futurice and whatnot. Also, one thing is, please give me as much feedback as you can. So meaning that if there are parts that are unclear or parts that doesn't make sense to you, or if there are things that are really good that I should focus more, please let me know in the end of this. And throw me as much questions as you want and as you can, or as much as you are interested on. I'm going to present about how can you establish how establishing a threat modeling can help you transition from DevOps to DevSecOps. Few words, well, we are from Futurice. But you actually might not know who am I, because I started fairly recent in Futurice. I started like 2 months ago. So I'm Bruno, and I'm a principal architect and technology advisor. I'm from Portugal, but I've been living in Helsinki actually for the past 7 years. I've been focusing mostly on architecture, cloud, DevOps, and AI. And we all love our hobbies. Coffee is one of my hobbies. I love also music, traveling, and indoor climbing. When we think about DevOps, and actually, like if you go and actually Google it, what is DevOps and what is DevSecOps, you will find in the top these two definitions. And the first definition actually is from Amazon.com. So AWS states DevOps as the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools. And DevSecOps by Sumo Logic, which was one of big DevOps company, they call it DevSecOps as a philosophy for integrating security practices within the DevOps process. And interesting thing, like if you look at both the two definitions from two different companies, one from DevOps, another from DevSecOps, there's a huge emphasis in the word philosophies. The philosophy of integrating, the cultural philosophies. So, meaning that it's interesting because, as you know, like DevOps is not the tool, is not just a culture, is the people that make it. And I want to explore a bit that when we go and talk a bit about security in our day-to-day lives. Meaning that probably you all see this type of diagram, this Venn diagram, that it's a nice, funny way to explain DevOps and explain DevSecOps. You have software engineering, you have quality, you have operations, and you have security, and you bundle it up, and boom, you have DevSecOps. Fantastic. It looks fantastic on paper, fantastic on brochures. What does it mean to you in the day-to-day life? So the thing is that from a cultural aspect, when you look at how it's been, our roles have been evolving. And if you look a couple of years back, even not that long ago, you had like a lot of roles like system administrator, network engineer, quality engineer, developer, front-end developer, back-end developer, full-stack developer nowadays, and InfoSec guy. And those roles, some of them don't really exist in some companies anymore. Some of them are just evolving. So for instance, nowadays there's new roles, titles, that didn't exist 5 years ago. You have site reliability engineer. You have DevOps engineer, which is, I hate actually that term as a role. And software engineer. And what does it tell you? It tells you that there is a lot more roles that are a bit more broad in what you are supposed to do. When you look, for instance, the roles of system administrator and network engineer, most of them evolve to DevOps engineer. And one of the reasons that happens is that, or what that happened, is that when you think like network engineer, one of the things that public cloud brought to you is software-defined networks, meaning that through code, you can define your network and how the networks connect to each other. You can define VPNs, everything through, Terraform, CloudFormation, whatnot. And so the role of a network engineer is less and less, dealing with the physical switches and routers and with the cabling. It becomes more as a software engineer job. And similar with sysadmin, it's a lot less about handling servers here and there. You end up actually defining everything as a code. And so it's kind of natural that this evolution goes. But one of the things that it ends up happening is that, especially now with serverless becoming more and more frequent and more in our day-to-day lives, is that people start using the term no-ops. And it is one of my personal hates, that term, because technical people like you will understand what it means with that, but usually management doesn't really understand it. Meaning that when they think about no-ops, they think, hey, I used to have developers and I used to have operations, so this means that, hey, I don't need sysadmins. I don't need operations-minded people, which is a mistake. You always need it. You always need the architects. You always need the operations people, the people that understand the infrastructure. You just need it less. Or that role changed. And I think that if you ever face that, you will need to some arguments to explain that to the the C-level. And I will give you that argument in the next slide. But one thing that also, if you look at the Venom chart with the InfoSec or the security now bringing there, what did happen to that role before? In most of the companies, that role is like one-person man band. I mean, you have like one CISO or one InfoSec guy. And obviously, you're not going to bring a CISO to your development team. So what's the role of the security in all of this? How do you bring a security guy or the security to a DevOps team, which is the whole purpose of this presentation? But so when you think all of this, and when you want to explain to to management, to the C-level, I'm going to offer you the best slide ever. So every time that they say that we don't need operations, you're going to think about this slide. So this one, which is a whole new concept, which is not DevOps. It's called CXOps. It means that you go to your board members and you say to your leadership team and you say like, hey, there's a CEO, there's a CFO, like we don't need finance. Now, like we have one person that does all those jobs. We don't need that anymore. So think about this. What does actually this means? This means that this role actually already exists. It's called entrepreneur or founder, which is one man, the guy does everything. But of course, when the companies are bigger, you always need these roles. You need to have roles, or at least the competences. And that leads me to one thing, which is when we think about DevOps and DevOps teams or development teams, we need to think in a holistic level. We need to think in a human level. And in a human level, we have people that are composed of multiple skills. We have a holistic approach towards DevOps, meaning that we have more and more T-shaped persons. This is not a new term, T-shaped person or T-shaped skills. It's something that from the agile world. But it means basically it divides in two parts. So on the vertical level, you have your hard skills, your strong expertise, your core skills, and on the horizontal level, you have the things maybe that you are interested on. You also work it, but they are not your core strong skills. For instance, this is my own T-shaped skills. I actually made it here for Futurice. We have an advisory offsite. So it reflects me basically like, okay, what do I usually work on? Where do I spend 80% of my time maybe? And those are my vertical skills. And then on the horizontal level, thinking like, what are all the other things that I do that I'm passionate about it, but they're not actually my main job maybe, but they are related with my job, which in my case like mentoring, coaching, speaking, digital cultural transformations. And the purpose of this is that I wanted you to think, and the purpose of this talk, I want you to think that if you are a developer, how can you add security to your horizontal level? I'm not expecting you to, of course, if you want to do it, it's a different thing. But I'm not expecting you to, all of a sudden, like I'm going to spend 80% of my time thinking about security. But I want you to spend like maybe the other 20% of your time thinking about security in your day-to-day. Point is that in most of the companies, you still have this one guy, which is the InfoSec guy or the CISO guy. But more and more, the development teams, they need to have people like you that maybe they are not, that you are not spending all the time thinking about security and the latest threats and whatnot, but you are thinking about it, and you are using that in your day-to-day life. And the question now is, how can you use this in your day-to-day life? Because that's usually where people kind of like don't really, they struggle, and teams struggle to do this. But one concept is threat modeling. And threat modeling is not a new term. It's actually quite an old term in InfoSec world. But threat model, by definition, by OWASP, is it works to identify, communicate, and understand threats and mitigations. Now, think about those four things. Identify, communicate. Meaning that we know what are the threats, and we talk openly about that within our teams. So we understand them, and we try to mitigate it. Understand them, it doesn't mean that you're going to make your application bulletproof towards any kind of threats. You can't actually. It's pretty much impossible. There is always something. There will always be something. But if you understand at least where are your problems and you try to mitigate them, that's the value that this brings. Now, there is a gazillion ways to do threat modeling. There's actually a lot of these methodologies to do this. There is VAST, PASTA, Strike, and Stride. I'm going to talk about Stride, not just because it's the most famous one. It's my personal favorite, because I think it's really easy to understand and to actually implement in the day-to-day. There are threat modelings that are methods that are more, for instance, focused on the privacy aspect. I think the Stride is actually quite broad in the sense that you can actually use it for most of the situations, and you can also extend it with some parts of, for instance, you can extend it with some things to handle the privacy aspect, which I think is really, really nice. So what does this mean in practice? Stride is an acronym for this 6 terms: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And these terms will be used by you to guide your thinking in your day-to-day life. But the whole threat modeling process usually is composed by a workshop. And so how can we actually bring this type of process in our day-to-day life? So what does it mean in practice? When we want to do a threat modeling session, we want to focus into something, meaning that means that we need to have obviously something to threat model about. And usually when you think about your application, you are thinking about the high-level architecture, and that is fine, and you can actually start with that. You can start with your application as a whole, or you can start with only one part of that. And for instance, as an example, thinking about something really, really, really simple. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it, but there's a concept called Bastion Hosts, which means that a Bastion host in public cloud is it's an instance or a server or a set of servers that you deploy in a DMZ area, in a public area, that you use as a gateway to connect to your internal infrastructure. It's a fairly kind of easy way for you to connect to private instances, making only one point exposed to the internet. And I want just to guide our thinking now during the rest of the presentation on this particular problem. That this is our architecture. We have a Bastion host, and we have Linux instances, and we can SSH to those. We can access those instances by SSH into our Bastion host. So if we have something like this, we can say that our scope of our threat model will be, for instance, just a Bastion host. We don't necessarily need to take the whole picture, but the Bastion host and the security group associated with it, that's what we want to threat model. Now, who should be in a threat model? Naturally, someone to facilitate, because it's a workshop. It should be as neutral as possible, meaning that someone that is not even involved in, for instance, making the Bastion host. But if you don't have someone that is neutral, it's okay. But that role needs to exist, that even if you know about what is there, you need to be as neutral as possible to guide the discussion. I think that's maybe the best way to describe it. Now, obviously, the people that develop the application or the DevOps team that is in that, the architect, product owner, whoever uses it, the Bastion host, if it's not the same people. So it can be very broad, the who can be on the threat modeling, but everyone that is in there, it needs to be very active, meaning that you don't want people that are passive and don't really contribute to the discussion. Now, how you do it, now this is my way of doing it, and there's a lot of ways to do threat modeling, or to organize the workshop. Usually, the workshop is the best way to do it, in my opinion, but there are other ways to do it. There's gamification of threat modeling. For instance, there's, in terms of duration, usually 2 to 4 hours, depending what's the scope. That's why you want to be strict. Frequency also depends a lot. You can actually have it every month if you want. You can have it every day if you want. But I suggest once a quarter, or at least once every semester. And now, thinking all of those terms, for each of the terms in the stride, what you're going to do is that you're going to put yourself and your entire team in the attacker's shoes. So in our case, in our Bastion host, we're going to think from each of the terms, what can an attacker do to that system? Before we move to the next term, we want to exhaust all the possible things that come to our mind. There is no limit of questions or anything. Like, we want to think about everything that comes to our mind. Then typical outcomes for each of the terms is that there will be proposals to change the architecture altogether, proposals to change some security measures to implement or to remove them altogether, and some other parts that we will not know how to solve, and we will just mark them as like, we need to investigate this part a bit later. And so going term by term, what are we kind of like thinking? Like, for instance, the spoofing one. Spoofing is basically, you want to pretend, it's an attacker that pretends to be something or someone that they are not. And by someone or something means that they can pretend to impersonate a user, or they can try to impersonate another resource. And typical questions on this is that, how do you authenticate the user or service? So thinking about our Bastion host, how are you authenticating it? Are you using SSH keys? Are you using SSH passwords? If you're using passwords or keys, where and how are you injecting those? So stating all of those things, how the Bastion, how those keys, for instance, let's say that's SSH keys, which is the most typical one, how those keys appear there. When you add and remove someone, how do you populate those? How do you invalidate those? How can you impersonate another user? So answering all of those questions, obviously we not have 2 hours, I'm not going to make a proper, which you're not going to make a proper threat model of this, but those are the type of questions that in spoofing you will do it. And for instance, one thing that will be that, for instance, that you will realize is that, hey, I'm pushing my SSH keys because I'm baking an AMI for this. And then, of course, it's kind of, you will go like, okay, how does the AMI get baked? Who has access to it? So word of advice in this is that it goes like a rabbit hole. That the more you push to certain questions, the more out of the scope you will be. So you need to be, the facilitator needs to be very strict into keeping the scope on the Bastion host and not on everything surrounding it. So when you think, for instance, in tampering, and tampering is to manipulate or to change the information that you are not supposed to. So practical questions in our case is that, can I change other person information? So if I'm logging in as Bruno in the Bastion host, and if Futurice is also logging in, can I actually change the information on his home directory? Like, why can't I? What prevents me to do it? So it's thinking all about these questions. How can you do that? So now if we think like repudiation states its ability to claim that you didn't do certain actions, no matter if you did it or not. So immediately think about audit trails. So it means that if I logged in into the Bastion host and I do an action, how does, for instance, how does the InfoSec guy or the rest of my team prove that I did that action? what kind of evidence there is. What if I say, no, I didn't log in? Are there logs? Where are the logs stored? Who has access to the logs? Things like that. Information disclosure. So to leak or expose information. So I'm logged into the Bastion host. What information do I access? Can I access? And when I can access that information, let's say that the Bastion host gives me access to, let's say, financial data. Can I actually, from the Bastion host, can I push that to the whole internet? Can I expose that somehow? Can I open up, can I create a web server in the Bastion host to expose that? So it's thinking like, is the information in that system sensitive, or the information that that system has access to is sensitive, and why is it sensitive? So making those questions to mitigate how the information can be leaked, if it is. And denial of service to prevent the system to actually perform or provide a service. Meaning that, hey, the Bastion host, is it critical that is always up and running? Can we afford downtime on it? If so, if we can afford downtime, or even if you can't, how likely it is that there will be downtime on this service? Meaning that, if you have a Bastion host in AWS, for instance, is it in an auto-scaling group? If the instance die, how long does it take to respawn? Do you need more than one to have? Do you need high availability? Questions like that. An elevation of privilege, and so to gain rights to do things that you're not supposed to. So this one is fairly easy in a Linux system. It's like, can you use sudo or not type of question, but also means that, for instance, if the sudo configuration is created from the baked AMI, can I, not in the live system, but can I, on the AMI configuration, can I actually inject, let's say that, hey, I want to have sudo on this. Do I have the rights to do so in order to elevate my privilege there? So those are the questions that we are thinking when we are thinking about the stride. This is the last one of the stride. Maybe one of the things is that you can actually make it fun. And I actually learned this. I mean, I've been doing threat modeling for quite many years, and I learned this like 2 weeks ago. Literally, that there's actually a game for threat modeling, a card game from Microsoft, nonetheless. Open sourced, nonetheless. You can actually download all the cards for free. And it was created by this guy, Adam Shostak, and that was in Microsoft. And he actually maintains that web page with there's a lot of list of games related with security. I was actually fascinated by it. Most of them are not about threat modeling, but there was one, for instance, Dungeons and Data, fantastic game, fantastic title name. So there's a lot of interesting things about security in terms of gamification. I was very surprised, and this elevation of privilege, you can actually buy these cards printed. I actually bought it yesterday for Futurice, so you can expect that in a couple of days or weeks we will have our own card game. If someone wants to play and try it within their own system, ping me. I'm dying to try this to see how this works. And I actually bought it with an extension package for the privacy. So there's actually an extension pack, yeah. So you can actually do privacy assessments for GDPR to guide your GDPR thinking. I'm fascinated by that. I think it's fantastic. It's an extension pack from LogMeIn. But I actually know that F-Secure also has their own extension pack for this. So really, really interesting. And this is fairly new, 3-4 years old, which for threat modeling is kind of old, new, because it's an old process. But what kind of learning outcomes can you actually get from threat modeling and stride? You will get a backlog. You get a backlog of things of all the findings, and mostly new work that was uncovered. So things that you might need to modify in the system, or things that you might need to investigate further. One kind of side effect that I actually like is that usually people don't really have nice documentation. It's very easy to get it outdated. And one of the bonus effects or side effects of threat modeling is that since you need to start with with the architecture diagram or the flow diagram, it kind of forces you naturally to actually have the documentation updated. I mean, you don't necessarily need to have a pretty diagram in the beginning. You can draw it in the whiteboard, but since you need to kind of document those findings as part of your outcomes of threat modeling, and you end up having this up-to-date diagrams, architecture diagrams. So it's actually nice from the documentation perspective as well to do this. And the other is that for compliance reasons, like when you are thinking like GDPR, there's this document called your PIA, which is Private Impact Assessment. So it means that what kind of personal data you have in that system, how does that, who can access those things. It's a really interesting document that is a legal document. And one of the parts of that document actually, like, it actually asks, like, do you do threat modeling, and where are the most recent, in a way, where can I find the outcomes of the most recent threat modeling? So it actually helps you on that from a compliance and legal aspect as well. All right, that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you. And I'm open to questions if you have.
Thank you for the great talk. Quick question. At what point of designing an architecture you have to do this game, if you want to call it a game, and how frequently you should, like iteratively do it throughout the whole process?
Yeah. A good question, especially like the beginning question, the question like when you are developing a project, like when can you actually start doing this? I think there's not right and wrong answers here. I think it's usually when you are starting to plan a project, you usually start with the architecture, nonetheless. So even without a single line of code, you can actually start doing threat modeling. As long as you have a good picture of how the architecture will be, you can start it. I use it that, for instance, I do threat modeling with myself when I'm designing a system. I think it's actually one nice way when I'm trying to come up with an architecture for something. So yeah, there is not really right or wrong answers to it, but how frequently also depends on the team and what is what is the pace of development, because you can also like do it after every sprint or every X amount of sprints, just to validate your thinking. So the more frequent you do, the less lengthy those sessions are, and I think that's the key thing. If you spend like 1 year, or if you never done it, in the beginning you will have a lot of findings, because the common knowledge of the team around the system, the way that each developer perceives the system is not yet the same. And you might think it is, but it's not until you actually do this type of exercises. Because this will force you to put both in the attacker's shoes, but also in the user's shoes. How someone uses the system in a legitimate or illegitimate way.
I know that someone on remote might have a question, but I'm just going to like throw another one really quick. Thinking about this thinking model as a framework, not tight coupled to the architecture and system engineering, but more of a framework to find the security corner cases in a general system. Can I, as for example, a client developer, for instance, apply this framework and thinking model of what I do in a daily basis?
Absolutely. It doesn't need to be to something like complex. It can be you are developing like front end, and your code is running somewhere, and you can just think about that. Like you can make a threat modeling about everything, about the phone, about a chair or a table. Like it doesn't really. Of course, if you make it about the table, you will not have much to threat model about. But still, how lengthy it is depends on the complexity that you have and how the team is. But you can apply it to pretty much everything. So when I'm doing my job, I often think about those terms. Can someone impersonate the other? And even when I was developing more frequently, when I was a software engineer, I also used to use maybe not so extensively this, but some of this as part to guide my thinking. So it all goes with the T-shape. Like
very
how
interesting.
Often,
yeah. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks for presentation. I would like to ask your opinion in serverless infrastructure or serverless architecture. How much, in your opinion, the DevOps and DevSecOps, need to be followed or applied on everyday basis, and that's it?
That's a really good question. Also because this serverless and this no-ops type of movement is becoming, in a way, it's going to people are raising maybe the wrong questions, which is like, do I still need ops? And I'm sorry to tell you, but you still need ops. It's the same as saying in a couple of years there will be a no devs type of movement. So that means that we're all without a job and stuff like that. But in serverless, you are basically, using components a bit off the shelf. So, and if you actually, for instance, if you're using Amazon and Lambda and whatnot, and if you're going to read actually Amazon security guidance, you will see like there's this shared responsibility model. And of course, by using serverless things, there's less responsibility to you and more to Amazon, but there's still responsibility to you. There will always be responsibility to you, especially on the security, meaning that how do you actually use it, those services? Like for instance, you can use, let's say, S3, but it's your option to choose or not encryption at rest. And those are the questions. Maybe the threat modeling will be less, sessions will be less lengthy, but you always need to do that for compliance reasons.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.